Hi everyone, welcome to our fifth video lecture on the sociology of innovations and entrepreneurship. And we're going to be discussing in this specific lecture the sociology of economic inventions. So in this session, we're going to be talking about the sociological perspective on the role of inventors, and then we'll talk about the construction or the emergence of the creative class and economic development, and then we'll talk about the different types of inventors, and eventually we'll talk about the organizational studies on innovation. So for our first thinker that contributed to the understanding of the sociological perspective of inventions and inventors is going back to Sombart. So in examining the role of inventors and inventions, Sombart first argued that it is the type of economic system that kind of influenced the way we see inventors and the way their work was organized. And then he was able to identify three epochs, and these were the Middle Ages, Renaissance, Baroque, and the second half of the 18th century onwards. And for the Middle Ages, he called the economic system as feudal artisanal. For the Renaissance Baroque, he called it early capitalism. And for second half of the 18th century onwards would be mature capitalism. According to Sombart, the nature of the economic systems and the way inventors were influenced by or influenced that time were based on three elements. And the first one is the economic mentality, which is basically the set of elements that guided economic activity during that time. We have technology, which is the set of processes that economic actors employ to achieve goals. And lastly, the organization of work, where we talk about the rules to which economic transactions are subject. Now, when talking about the spiritual elements that guide economic activity, we have the traditional, wherein we just follow what has been part of the norms, and also based on the authority. So usually it is the feudal lords or the empires that have established these practices. And then we have the empirical, where basically people are just doing methods that were handed down and were passively accepted. And then we have the rational. The rational is when based on a systematic review of adequacy of means of relation to ends, meaning we use some form of logical reasoning for us to be able to identify point A to point B, why we think a certain method is useful. However, we don't really use scientific processes in them. And then we have the scientific. So for scientific, it is basically when the rationality of procedure is based on causal explanation of the natural phenomena, and it has been experimented on or it has been tested, and there was really empirical evidence or observable evidence to say whether or not these methods is effective or not. So these were the type of spiritual elements of economic activity that could be the basis wherein we could define this economic system. Also, Sombart identified organic versus inorganic. So when you say organic, the means of work is done by living beings, so humans and animals. But for inorganic, the work or the production can already have been done by machines. So kaya siya nakakabit sa mechanical. So for the feudal artisanal epoch during the Middle Ages, we have the traditionalist empirical organic. So what they're doing, the methods that they were using during this period were just what has been handed down to them. And the actors during this time were the artisans. And then for the early capitalism, we have rationalist, empirical, organic. It means that they make use of logical models, but these are just something that they passed on from one generation to the next, or they had been there was an authority that had told them that this has been correct, but it has not really been scientifically tested during the time in early capitalism. And the people who were inventing during that time were already called inventors. And then we have mature capitalism, wherein the technology type is already inorganic, meaning we already are making use of machines in order for us to produce products or do work. And then there's already an acceptance of the scientific method for us to be able to generate inventions. And we had a different organization of work in terms of inventors, and we'll talk about them later. So during the feudal artisanal period, we had the artisans, and the work of inventions were through masters and apprentices. But as you can see, there was really no formalized education or formalized credentialization for them. So they were just doing, and then they were trying whether it worked or not. And then, as I said, during the early capitalism, inventors were already coined. That term was already coined, and then we had amateur and professional people who were already working on. There were amateur inventors who were already doing their inventions on their own, and then there were those who were hired or they were working in order to create new methods and products. But the role of inventors had become more specialized, or has become more differentiated during the time of mature capitalism. So according to Sombart, there are three subjective conditions that contributed to the proliferation of inventions during the time of mature capitalism. So during mature capitalism, we had the creation of technical institutes or laboratories and we had discussed this during the last session. There had been an establishment of research departments in large companies, and there has been a subsidizing or incentivizing of the inventors' freedom to invent, and therefore it created it diversified the type of inventors that we had during mature capitalism. So we had inventive geniuses who lacked professional specialization, but they are still able to introduce new types of technology, albeit of course not very complex. And then we have the lay inventors who came up with occasional inventions, discovering a wide variety of things, but of secondary importance. And then we have the specialized professionals whose mission in work was really to invent. So they might have been employed for them to do inventions. Now, Sombart also identified in his work what motivates inventors to invent, and he identified three. The first one is the joy of inventing. So people invent because they're very passionate about it and they want to do it. They want to be able to create something, and that's something that we can all relate to. And then we have the pursuit to success. So maybe they want to be known in their specific field of work. And then of course the desire for gain. Maybe it is a lucrative, as we know, being an inventor, especially in certain industries, it's a lucrative profession and you can really gain money out of it. So yeah, so these are the three motivations based on Sombart, and he argues that this is something that we can all have when we try to invent something, probably in different extents, but basically these are the three that is common across all the inventors. And then we have another classical sociologist that looked into economic inventions, and that is Gabriel Tarde, and he's a French academic, and he wrote his notable work is on the laws of imitation. So Tarde was very individualistic in his approach to looking at society and the inventions that happen in society, and he argues that it is the individuals who are the basic unit of analysis in sociology, and therefore in studying inventions, the inventors are also the point of analysis. According to Tarde, society consists of a network of mental states of interacting individuals, and therefore inventions are also a product of relations with other people. He argues also that most of our life waste in society is us trying to imitate what others do on an everyday basis. So every day is an imitation of what we're supposed to do, an imitation of the social consciousness of other people. And according to him, when somebody tries to break away from that sense of imitation, that is where invention is born. So he really thinks that it is the individual, no, that really decides on whether or not an invention is going to happen, because that person decides to, or thinks about, or has a desire to be able to think outside that law of imitation. However, despite being very individualistic in the approach, being the sociologist he also was able to look at different social and institutional factors that can influence a certain person's individual genius, that can lead them away from imitation and produce the inventions. For example, the current social inequalities that we have make upper class more inventive compared to lower social classes, because more socially privileged people have access to better education. That will, of course, increase their opportunities to become inventive geniuses. And then, of course, there are barriers of status stimulate the creativity of the elite, and can distance them from mass conformism. So, it's easy to think outside of the box and take risks, and go to a certain field that you don't really have to conform, because there's money for you to fall back. So it's easier for richer people to invent and innovate compared to poorer individuals and groups. And then, of course, academic institutions guarantee freedom of thought and research. So there are certain institutions, like more menial work institutions, that are really focused on that are really focused on getting the work done, but not really focused on innovating. But for example, if a certain person is working in the academia, they're more likely to be compelled to think outside the box and make research. Same thing, for example, when you're talking about you're working in an accounting firm versus you're working in Apple or Google, wherein you are really compelled to think of innovative ideas. Then, of course, we have geographical and social isolation that hinders the inventive ability of society, groups, and individuals. And we've talked about this, how being a migrant, the ability to be able to migrate and look at different ideas can also increase your inventive capacity as a person. And then, of course, cultural norms influence and guide inventive ability. So there are certain cultures in general who allow deviating ideas, non-conformity, and there are those, and we know some of those countries, who are more conservative and very restrictive in terms of new ideas. And he also argues that, an inventor could have invented something, but the extent to which a certain invention gets to become successful is also socially influenced. So, any inventive process can begin with an interior purpose for a certain inventive genius and a favorable exterior opportunity, social conditions that will make that person be compelled and get resources to be able to invent something. But the next is the diffusion of that technology. How are you able to communicate that technology, to be able to reproduce that technology that you have created? Right? So if you don't have the means, or if you're living in a society that really does not put value on the specific technology that you've made, then the diffusion might not be as successful as would in a place wherein that technology that you've made would be appreciated. And an example would be, for example, you're a chef and you are living in, for example, in a highly Catholic, in a highly Catholic community, and you start trying to design food or create new meals that are halal in nature. And it can be inventive, but the diffusion within the community, they might not be so interested in the halal food, because it's not really part of their Catholic edicts to really eat or consume halal prepared foods. Maybe you have a specific audience for that. But the diffusion of that in a purely Catholic community may not be as successful as compared to, for example, you have a burgeoning audience of Muslim migrants in that community, then you'll have, increasing rates for diffusion. So in short, while he argues that our inventive capacities, our desire to invent, can be something that could be looked at an individual level, but he argues specifically in the part of diffusion that the extent to which your invention becomes used by many people and becomes known by many people is also socially influenced. And then he identifies two types of inventions. The first one is an invention that has a new combination of sensations and images, which then generate new desires. And the inventions that create a demand that is not even there, and we know that Apple is very good at that. Creating products that actually compel demand, make people need something they never thought they needed, and combine certain aspects and makes something new after combining those things. So that's the first one. And then number two is produce actual well-known objects and make them cheaper and more accessible. So for example, you are able to set up a company and recreate most of Samsung or Apple's smartphone features, but you offer them at a lower price. That's also something very inventive, and that's one of the reasons. Like for example, OnePlus, and Oppo had been very successful, especially when they first entered the market, because they were mid-range. So when you really think about it, that's also inventive, because they were able to recreate a lot of majority of the features that the flagship phones had, but they were half the price, and people were gravitating towards, especially the masses were gravitating towards it, and that can also be considered as an innovation as well. Next, we have William Ogburn, and William Ogburn mostly wrote during the 1920s to the 1930s in the US, so before the World War II, and he argued that when that material culture changes quickly, material cultures are anything tangible that is attached to a certain culture, and we have non-material culture or adaptive culture, which basically is our norms, values, our folkways, our mores, our beliefs. So according to Ogburn, material culture generally changes quickly, but non-material culture changes slower compared to material culture. And that is true. Like for example, when you talk about reproductive technologies, condoms, birth control pills had been early on introduced in the Philippines, and then but because we are living in a country that is very conservative, very Catholic oriented, very family oriented, it took some time for our formal non-material culture, for our formal norms to change, for us to be able to codify our norms into laws, to the Reproductive Health Act. And the extent to which the non-material culture catches up to the non-material culture is able to catch up with the material culture is different from one nation to the other. So more developed nations, especially because they have better purchasing powers, it's easier for them to be able to integrate new material culture, new inventions into their ways of life. But there are certain countries may not be. It's either because they are not economically prepared, or not structurally prepared to be able to infuse them into our into our way of life, or maybe they have values, or these countries have values that are not that are contradictory to the values attached to this material culture, and that period, that gap in the that gap between non-material culture catching up to material culture is called the cultural gap. And when that cultural gap gets longer, That's called cultural lag. And there are certain countries that have longer cultural lags compared to others. Like, for example, I would say that the cultural lag in the Philippines is longer compared to that in the United States. I would say that the cultural lag in North Korea would be longer than that of the Philippines because of the very restrictive nature for Western technologies in North Korea. So that is the argument of Ogburn. So the extent to which our inventions are placed into our cultural collectiveness or cultural consciousness is influenced by how fast non-material culture adapts to material culture. Do we have a cultural lag or do we have a shorter cultural gap? He also believes that, the inventor could be considered as a great man with very good insight, a genius, with a very skilled person, and has a lot of agency, to be able to bring forth change to the society. But he also argues that there are social forces that influence the greatness of that man. The greatness of the inventor is influenced by social forces, and one of these are the social conditions, the tangibility and the intangibility of the social conditions. We know, especially when we talk about inventors or thought or radical thinkers, that we used to laugh at in the past, because they were talking about futures that we couldn't even imagine, and usually we can't really fathom that because we have cultural lag nga, so the greatness of those great men are more likely put to waste or are not used immediately because of a more restrictive culture or because of cultural lag. And of course, the social evaluations of the values of the group. So first is social conditions, whether or not we have economic, the person has economic access to be able to make the invention come true, or if the person is rich enough to be able to get education, or if he is in a geographic location that will make him more likely make that creation, or he or she may have colleagues, that will be able to help them be able to create this invention. But also the values that we have, the social evaluation, the values that we have as society also influences the opportunities of the great man to be able to invent new things. And according to Ogburn, the inventive level of societies can be influenced by the following. One, economic demand and resources invested on inventions and innovations. And I would say that in the Philippines, we still have a lot to improve on or to enhance on in terms of the economic demands for new technologies. We have a lot of economic demands actually, especially for local and nativized technologies, and trying to commercialize the nativized technologies. Like, for example, we have the Lagundi capsule for cough. So that was kind of a model project that eventually kind of stirred the OST. Hey, maybe we can look at other herbal medicines used by IP communities or rural communities in the Philippines, and let's see whether or not we can turn them to actual medicine, patent this under the Philippines, and maybe could be a source of commercial and work for those, for people who could work in the context of herbal medicine development. So one of the economic demands actually in the Philippines, especially in the field of health, is the creation of herbal and traditional and alternative medicine, because we have resources for that in the Philippines. But in terms of budget allocation, macroeconomic policies, do we really have allocations for that? And do we improve our scientific community? Do we have scientific human resources to actually produce these products? So the extent to which we have macroeconomic policies that are friendly to innovations influences the innovativeness of a society, and of course the rise of inventors in a society. Next is we have the size and diversity of the population. So the more diverse populations are, the more they could be inventive. Remember, in terms of talking about margins, when we talk about complex relationships, right? In the previous sessions, no? So there. And then we have provision of communication networks and socio-territorial collocation, which can facilitate or hinder the diffusion of innovation from one sector or from one social group to another. Like for example, in the private sector, we are booming in terms of digital technologies, but the government sector is kind of lagging behind in terms of inculcating computerization and digitalization in their ways. But of course, they were forced during COVID. But without COVID, I don't think that some government agencies would have worked faster enough to digitalize some of the services. Unlike the private companies who really wants to digitalize because, of course, they're very profit driven. And then from the previous work, Colum Gilfillan, wrote a book on the sociology of invention. And basically, the perspective of that book is that invention is incremental. It means it takes some time for us to be able to see an invention to happen because there are many things to consider in order to develop an invention. It's also evolutionary in terms of a process, and it's shaped by impersonal social forces. So, a person can have psychological resources and biological resources to be able to become an inventor, but those could be wasted if the social conditions and the social evaluations do not really compel a person to be able to invent something. And I actually argued that inventors are mere mediators of social forces. I think my argument here and my critique here is that it kind of takes away some agency. This argument takes away agencies from inventors. Siguro, speaking as a scientist myself, I think you have to give us some sort of credit, some sort of agency for the things that we are able to think about. No, there is some sort of agency that also, and we're not just mere mediators of social forces. But I can see the point why Gilfillan would say that, no? Because again, as every human being, we're not produced in a vacuum. We're always embedded in a social context. But I believe that there is some form of agency for people when they think of innovative ideas, when they start their own entrepreneurship ventures. I think there's an agency to that. It's not just compelled by social forces. And because of this argument on, inventors are merely social forces, alongside that, there was also a psychological reductionism. And we discussed this in the previous session, no? The psychology of creativity, the psychology of innovations. And there were kind of sort of competing perspectives until we looked into the final model in the last session. Until the point that we just look at invention as a routinized thing. It's a routine that people do, especially in knowledge economies, wherein new knowledge, new products is something that we expect as an output of the given society. And so, a more contemporary thinker, Richard Florida, thought about the creative class. So who are the creative class? So basically, before we talk about the creative class, we have to think that advanced economies or knowledge economy, those that are already in the fourth industrial revolution, are already in their creative era or their creative age, and their main means of production is services, no, production of services and knowledge and information economy, and in these types of economies, especially in the developed countries, we have a specific class of people who could be called the creative class. So the creative class are people who add economic value through their creativity, and we have the super creative core, the scientists, right, the inventors, the engineers, whose work actually is to invent. So those are super creative core, and also the creative professionals, people who perform professional roles in society, like for example, healthcare, teaching, agriculture, but make use of complex knowledge in order for them to accomplish this work. So according to that, to Richard Florida, they are the people from the creative class, no? Whose role in society is to produce economic value by being creative or being innovative. And then also, Florida identifies three T's that, increases creativity in a society and innovativeness in a society. And the first one is technology, self-explanatory, talent, again also self-explanatory, the extent to which you're able to develop your human capital in a given society. And we have tolerance, the extent to which the community or the society values new knowledge, puts policies that incentivizes new ideas. So there are also certain communities and areas in society that are more that has more ability to incentivize or sets up social conditions to enhance inventive capacities, and therefore Florida argues that there is such a thing as geography of development, meaning there are certain places in a given society wherein we expect more creative classes to be, more creativity to come out of. And for example, in the Philippines, that geography of development could be found in NCR because that's where most of our creative industries are. There's spiritually, there's more room for democratic thought, free thought, and there's also the seat of major educational centers are also found in NCR. So I would say that the geography, the main geography of development in the Philippines is in NCR. And then eventually, he described that the description of that place as a place wherein creative class could emerge from is the quality of place. Quality meaning, does that place, as I said, have technology and talent and tolerance to be able to engage people to actually be creative and make new inventions. And eventually, he argues that that place eventually becomes powerful. A lot of power comes from that place because there is where the new inventions are coming from. So, like for example, a good example of this is Silicon Valley, for example, in the United States. He argues that regional economic growth is driven by the location choices of creative people. But of course, Florida has been met with a lot of criticisms here because, of course, it disenfranchises some of the thinkers and creative thinkers who might be found in rural economies, whose work is on improving fisheries, and I would argue, especially in an agricultural, in a largely agricultural country like the Philippines, that we also bank on these communities, regardless of, there are not many technological complexes where the shores are or where the fields are, but there are a lot of inventive activities happening in terms of agriculture in the Philippines because, there's incentives to improve agricultural conditions because that is one of the bread and butter in the Philippines. And then, of course, that argument whether or not who's better at inventing or what makes better inventions made by an individual or inventions made by a group of inventors. Singh and Fleming begins this discussion by identifying how technological components are combined in order to introduce new inventions. So the first phase is the variation phase, where inventors try different combinations of existing ideas to generate new ideas. And then we have the selection phase, wherein these new ideas first undergo a process of evaluation, and then those ideas that are unpromising are discarded. And then during the retention phase, Ideas are passed through the first filter, are evaluated by members of the scientific professional community, and those that are deemed valid are taken up. So, for example, I am theorizing a new scholarly idea. So I explore the literature, the research literature, and see what is already available, and then I try to find gaps, and then I try to see what type of new connections I want to be able to see on the current literature that we have based on the gaps that they identify, and then what I will do is to be able to publish my work, no? And the variation and the selection phase is okay for solitary inventors or individual inventors, but the third one, as we said, there has to be some sort of validation in the and acceptance in the scientific professional community for you to be able to say na yeah, I was able to make a good enough invention, and it's hard to do that when you're alone. So increasing the consensus in the scientific professional community to be able to accept your invention will need some sort of collective effort. No? So therefore, C.N. Fleming appears to be leaning towards in team inventions instead of solitary inventions as easier inventions to kind of put into mainstream. Studies also say that independent inventors are more likely occasional inventors. As we know, also, occasional inventors aren't really those inventors who create like really high-stakes inventions. And also, there's also that argument on further clarifying or further categorizing inventors as hobby inventors and inventor heroes. So, hobby inventors are really those who do inventions for the passion of it and whose goal is really to just create new things, but not really to take on high stake objectives or high stake needs, compared to inventor heroes, or really are able to do radical innovation. And for inventor heroes, while there are individual inventors and individual creatives and individual thinkers who are really able to become inventor heroes on their own, like for example Albert Einstein or Stephen Hawking, but we understand that usually it's a team. No? It's a team that is able to really take on high stakes problems and be able to create radical innovations. Now, there is already also that phenomenon that is happening in our contemporary times, wherein there is an increasing pluralization and decentralization of innovation. And this is because innovations or inventions are in some cases a product of a joint effort in which it is difficult to distinguish individual contribution. Like for example, can you really point a specific person for the M1 Pro chip? I mean, there's someone talking during the Apple's presentation, but you can't really pinpoint it. But you can pinpoint it to Apple, but you cannot really say that this specific person, you can pinpoint this individual contribution. No? We're coming to that era wherein most of the products that are being offered to the market, the new ones, are usually done as a team or as an organization, and that inventive and innovation processes are becoming more open and collaborative than before. So the plurality of innovation is influenced by these four coordinates. The first one is collective invention, which is a particular type of inventive process wherein there's a free exchange of information. Free exchange of information between companies in the production sector. Faced with a common technical problem, they cooperate in order to find a solution, with each making a small cumulative contribution. So that the process is so that they will be able to solve common issues. Like for example, the issue on data privacy issues. So I think there are moments wherein the government and different technology companies are sitting together in order for them to be able to, look for common solutions to improve data privacy issues. I think, I hope they are doing their best and not really putting forth their individual motives when they put into the table data privacy issues. So that's something that, people in the tech industry can like sit down and really have a brainstorm together how they could improve and protect and make our data secure. But of course, the extent to which they do collective invention is on the following one. Maybe they could have huge potential from learning when they share experiences with other, for example, schools. Now we talk about, for example, there are school consortiums, no? So schools engage in this consortium with other universities because there is a huge potential of learning from that. And then number two, there's low opportunity costs. No, maybe we can partner with each other in terms of getting a certain innovation. Maybe you have a laboratory that we don't, so maybe we can hook you up with our laboratory. But basically, they also have market interests here. No? Like for example, will I do some sort of collective invention if there will be losses for me in the process. So that could be also a factor of engaging in collective innovations. And then next we have open innovation communities, wherein innovative partnerships adopt a form of community, and they're not really for economic profit. No, they're not existing because of economic desires or reasons. Examples of open innovative communities are computer scientists who create applications and share data with each other so that some applications could be offered to us for free, and give free licenses. Like for example, there are statistical softwares, because the private statistical software, the commercial ones, are very, very expensive. So some computer scientists, and information technologists, they actually try to see how these certain statistical softwares are able to do conduct statistical tests, and they try to make an open a free licensed software out of it. It is also motivated by intrinsic motivation. So people get into the bandwagon, in terms of open innovation communities because they love problem solving, and they also have technological professional interests. Like for example, if I'm able to give my information and my innovative capabilities for free, it can also make me gain some form of professional development as well. And next is extrinsic motivations. So maybe it could increase your professional reputation if you engage in open innovation communities. And also presence of pro-social actors. Means pro-social, volunteer organizations or civil society groups who can eventually enforce rules in that specific community. Next, we have democratization of innovation, wherein users and manufacturers are putting their heads together, or the users are being engaged into the innovative processes. And why would users who don't have technological interest or technological capacities want to innovate? Because maybe they can't find what they're seeking for in the market, and then they have specific needs. Like for example, they have specific disability needs, for instance, there are no disability inclusionary measures or affordances in the specific innovation, and they are able to and they need that specific inclusion or affordance in the specific innovation. So users are the ones who are creating innovative actions because they can't find their needs. Now, one thing I would say that is being moved here, and one of the issues is the open repair policy that is being pushed in the United States, because as we know, companies like Apple and Samsung, they just want the repairs to be among them so they could really jack up the price, and they don't want to give the information on the on the hardware and the software of the products that they're creating, so that they can monopolize the repairs, no? And so what happens is that the users, they create their own sort of communities for them to be able to create. But again, it's not completely democratized because the policy is still against them. So they're doing that, getting information about how to repair laptops on YouTube. They get this illegally and against Apple policies. We know, no, if Apple is able to tell whether or not you tried to fix your iPhone on your own, and then they will revoke all of your insurance or your warranty as soon as they find that out, no? So that is very undemocratic. So there's a movement towards, putting innovation in the hands of the users as well. So that's democratization of innovation. And the open innovation strategy is where management promotes incoming and outgoing knowledge flow, which is different from the usual closed model of innovation that we usually see in companies. Like, for example, Apple, they don't want to share how they make their iPhones, or the specific ones how to repair the iPhones. But open innovation strategies where companies or the management decides, we give them all the information. No, not all, but we give a substantial amount of information to people so that they can also provide us with information to how improve our products, no? But this is not, this is something new for companies. Some companies are kind of privy doing it because they feel like they're giving their goods away, they're giving their trade secrets away. But this is one of the new ways of trying to pluralize or decentralize innovation. Next, there's also that increasing conversations around organizing innovation, or the extent to which organizational factors influence innovations or creativity among people and companies. And the argument is that the organizational choices in terms of structure and processes affect the overall innovative capacity of that organization. And for example, you don't have an R&D committee or an R&D department in your company, then you don't expect a lot of research and development happening because there's no person or there's no human resource, just overlooking and supervising research and development. So that's an example of an organizational choice that can impede innovative capacity. But this is not only specific on research and development. Like, for example, the strategies, the vision, mission, and the goals of your institution also influence the extent to which you're able to create innovations. How open are your vision? To what extent do you do you put linkages as a part of your strategy? How much are you wanting to take into risks, or how much do you allocate for certain innovative activities, events, or initiatives in your company? Are also organizational choices. Now, ang argument here is that there's no best single way that can increase in innovation. So I do believe that based on the product or service of that specific organization, then there is a specific organizational mode or structure or strategy that they could use to improve it. So usually it's individualized per organization based on the context, the product, the service, the people that they already have, the largeness that they have, and then there are different eras of organizational design. So from the 1970s below, we have tall organization or self-contained orgs like this, wherein it's very bureaucratic. There's an argument that tall organizations and self-contained organizations, those organizations that are not porous and are not very much into partnerships and linkages, are less likely to become innovative compared to horizontal or flat organizations like what we have now. So horizontal organizations had been a thing in the 1980s and onwards. But for smaller sized organizations, we see now more likely open organizations wherein there's really no top down, and there's a and there's there's no visible hierarchy among people, no, like for example what we see on startups, right? So the level of authority is not so vertical and not so wide. So these are open organizations. Open organizations can be networked organization or networked firms wherein they combine units with a certain level of operational autonomy. It means that the sales can have their life of their own, the marketing can have their life of their own, or the R&D can have their life of their own, but also be connected in the organization. But there's not there's not really some sort of hierarchical comparison across these departments. And then we have the networks of organizations wherein we have to where we connect autonomous actors in cooperation with each others. Like for example, you have partnerships with external partners. Like for example, certain companies having, for instance, connections with private universities, no? And then we have territorial areas, for example Silicon Valley, and for example NCR, or for example you have UP Techno Hub. So this is an example of territory. And then of course you have the locus of innovation, wherein you have external learning networks, no, that are found. Another example of that is Silicon Valley. While there is no singular mode of an organization that can make it more innovative, these are some of what studies are suggesting in terms of how to make your organization more innovative, or how to increase the innovative capacity of your organization. One, mas innovative ang isang company when they have moderately high scientific diversity, meaning if they have people from different disciplines, then like we said, no, the more diverse, the more we are able to have crossovers in terms of the ideas. No, it exposes us to more ideas from different sources, and therefore being able to combine them to make them a new type of idea. And then there's communication and social integration between the scientists. No, for example, in our university, we make it a point that there are events wherein people from different colleges and departments, they talk together so that they could have, sharing of ideas that can lead to creation of projects. And of course, organizational leadership. If the leader is not promoting creativity, if the leader is not promoting inventiveness or innovativeness, then you don't expect that to flow into the strategies and the policies of that organization. And even if very innovative and creative ang mga employees, no, when you submit projects to the CEO, or you submit projects to the one financing those projects, and that person is not an innovative leader, those projects will not fly because he will not, or they will not achieve, or they will not sign those projects. So an innovative leader is needed in an organization in order for it to become innovative. I think that's a no-brainer. Next is recruitment. The ability for you to be able to get the best persons into your organizations will of course increase your innovative capacity. And next is the organizational flexibility and the autonomy of the different departments. So the more open the organization is, the more relaxed the organization is, the less hierarchical it is. The expectation is it's more democratized, and people are able to really share their radical ideas without being shamed or embarrassed about it. That increases innovative capacity in an organization. So, in summary, Ramella and Triglia kind of also made use of their Italy case, but I will not focus on the Italy case. I will focus more on their conclusions. That kind of wraps up neatly also all of the perspectives that we discussed, from the sociology of inventions and inventors, from the types of inventors, from the organizational aspects that influence inventions. So one, we as people who have social imagination, we argue that inventions and innovations are socially constructed. They're not coming from a singular person. Although we don't discount a person's agency to be able to invent, but we argue that the opportunities for invention and the extent to which those inventions get diffused in society is influenced by social forces. And therefore, there is an importance of an integrated study approach when you look at inventions and innovations. And I think that is the reason why we talk about this in the context of entrepreneurship, because entrepreneurship understands the importance of interdisciplinarity. That there's no singular perspective that can explain the extent to which innovations become successful, innovations become more accessible to the masses. And also, current studies are very much looking into the organizational aspects of innovations. And since we are now looking at inventors as employee inventors, as part of a larger organization instead of solitary inventors, it is important to put them in organizations that increase innovative capacities. As we explained earlier, there's no singular picture of a good organization that is inventive, but there are certain aspects of organizations that have been proven by studies to be more likely to produce innovative employees and innovations in general. And we also have to look at the logic of complementarity, meaning we look at innovations from an individual perspective, from an organizational perspective, and also from a territorial level. And I think there will be a specific discussion on this in the latter part of our course. So that's the end of our video lecture on the sociology of economic inventions.